The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises. It was 2:17 p.m. on a Sunday when Margaret Chen watched her former boss, the man who'd stolen 20 years of her life, realize he was about to lose everything. His hands were shaking, just slightly, but she noticed. She'd waited 7,304 days for this moment. But here's the thing nobody tells you about revenge. The worst part isn't the waiting. It's knowing that when you finally get it, you can never get those years back. And what Margaret was about to reveal, it would destroy more than just one man's career. It would expose a system that had protected him for decades. Let me take you back to where this all began. 1995. Silicon Valley was exploding. The internet was barely a thing most people understood, and Margaret Chen had just landed her dream job at Tech Vision Systems, a semiconductor company that would go on to be worth $14 billion. She was 32 years old, a single mother to 7-year-old Amy, and she'd just been hired as a junior engineer in the hardware division. Her boss was Richard Hartwell, 47 years old, MIT graduate, 2 patents to his name, and according to everyone in the industry, an absolute genius. The kind of person who could look at a circuit board and see possibilities nobody else could imagine. On Margaret's first day, he shook her hand and said, "I can tell you're going to do great things here." She believed him. For the first 6 months, everything seemed perfect. Margaret would work late, Amy staying with her mother 3 blocks away, designing solutions to problems that had stumped the team for months. She'd arrive at 7 a.m. before anyone else. She'd leave at 8 p.m. after everyone was gone. And slowly she started noticing something strange. Ideas she'd mentioned to Richard in private conversations would show up in team meetings the next day, presented by him with no mention of her name. The first time, she thought she'd misremembered. Maybe she'd heard him say it first? The second time, she took notes, dated them, time-stamped them. By the third time, she had a sinking feeling in her stomach that wouldn't go away. But Richard was her boss. He had 20 years of experience. She was new. And every time she tried to bring it up, he'd smile, that warm, paternal smile, and say something like, "Margaret, you're doing great work, but you need to understand how the industry works. Ideas are collaborative here. That's how innovation happens." She'd walk away feeling smaller, like maybe she was being too sensitive, too territorial. After all, she was just grateful to have the job. 3 years went by. Margaret had designed 17 major components for Tech Vision's flagship processor. 17. She had the documentation to prove it, design files, notes, emails where she'd outlined specific solutions to specific problems. But on paper? On the official patents? Richard Hartwell's name appeared as the primary inventor on all of them. Her name appeared once, as a contributing engineer. In 1998, the company went public. The stock price exploded, and Richard Hartwell became a very, very wealthy man. Margaret watched from her cubicle as he rang the opening bell at the NASDAQ. She watched him give interviews to Forbes and Wired magazine about his innovations that were revolutionizing the industry. And she said nothing. Because here's what nobody tells you about this kind of theft. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in tiny increments. Small enough that you question yourself. Small enough that when you try to explain it to someone else, you sound paranoid. Her friend Diana, another engineer at the company, pulled her aside one day in the parking lot. "Marge, I need to tell you something, and you might not want to hear it." Margaret's throat tightened. "What?" "I was in a meeting with Hartwell and the VPs last week. They were reviewing the Q3 roadmap, and Hartwell presented that thermal solution you showed me last month, the one with the dual-layer cooling system." What? He presented it as his own, drew it on the whiteboard, explained the whole thing. The VPs were blown away. They're fast-tracking it for the next chip generation. Margaret felt the parking lot tilt slightly. I have the files, she whispered. I have time-stamped files showing I designed that 3 months ago. Diana looked at her with something like pity. Then you need to do something about it, because he's not going to stop. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, Amy asleep upstairs, and opened her laptop. She started going through every file, every email, every piece of documentation from the past 3 years. By 4 a.m., she had compiled a 63-page document. 63 pages of evidence showing a clear pattern. She would propose a solution. Richard would say they needed to develop it further. Then, weeks later, that exact solution would appear in a patent application or product spec with his name on it. The next morning, she requested a meeting with HR. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Simmons, listened to her for 45 minutes, took notes, nodded sympathetically. This is very serious, Margaret. We'll need to investigate. Margaret felt a spark of hope. 2 weeks later, Patricia called her back in. We've completed our review, Patricia said, sliding a single piece of paper across the desk. Based on our investigation, we found no evidence of misconduct. Richard Hartwell has been with this company for 21 years. He's one of our most valued innovators. And frankly, Margaret, the nature of your claims could be considered defamatory. Margaret's hands went cold. Defamatory? I have documentation. You have notes, personal files. In a collaborative environment like ours, it's often difficult to determine the exact origin of an idea. Multiple engineers contribute. That's the nature of the work. I'm not multiple engineers. I'm one engineer whose specific, documented designs are being stolen. Patricia's expression hardened just slightly. I'd be very careful about making accusations like that. Richard is well respected in this industry, and you're still establishing your reputation. The subtext was crystal clear. Shut up, or you're done. Margaret walked out of that meeting and made a decision. She couldn't fight this battle now. She didn't have enough power, enough credibility, enough allies. But she could wait. And while she waited, she could document everything. So that's exactly what she did. For the next 17 years, Margaret Chen kept working at Tech Vision. She kept designing revolutionary solutions. She kept watching Richard Hartwell claim credit for her work. And she kept records. Every email, every design file, every meeting note, every timestamp. She created a personal backup server at home, completely separate from the company network, and copied every single piece of evidence. She took photographs of whiteboards before they were erased. She recorded conversations. In California, where single-party consent is legal, she kept a daily journal noting exactly what she worked on, what she proposed, and how long it took for those proposals to appear under Richard's name. Her daughter Amy grew up watching her mother work 80-hour weeks, watching her come home exhausted and bitter. "Mom," Amy asked once when she was 16, "why do you stay at that job if it makes you so unhappy?" Margaret looked at her daughter and said something she'd later regret. "Because someday, honey, the truth will matter. And when it does, I'm going to have every single piece of proof they could ever ask for." In 2012, something changed. Richard Hartwell was promoted to Chief Technology Officer. His face was everywhere. TED Talks, conference keynotes, magazine covers. He was the visionary leader who had pioneered modern chip architecture. And Margaret? She was still a senior engineer, making a decent salary, getting good reviews, but her name appeared on exactly 3 patents. Meanwhile, Richard's name was on 147. Then came 2015. The tech industry had started paying attention to diversity, to representation, to the voices that had been ignored and exploited. TechVision announced a new initiative, a company-wide review of patent attributions and intellectual property credits. They wanted to ensure fairness and accuracy in recognition of all contributors. When Margaret saw that email, her hands started shaking. This was it. She immediately filed a formal request for a comprehensive review of all patents filed between 1995 and 2015 that listed Richard Hartwell as the primary inventor. The company tried to narrow the scope, perhaps just the last 5 years? Margaret refused. All of them, every single one. They assigned an external law firm to conduct the investigation, probably hoping it would quietly go away. They had no idea what Margaret had been preparing for 20 years. The lawyers scheduled an initial interview with Margaret. They expected maybe some notes, some complaints, the usual he said, she said. Margaret showed up with 4 storage drives containing 10,000 files. 10,000. The lead attorney, a man named James Chen, no relation, actually laughed when he saw them. "Miss Chen, we're not going to need your entire file history." "Yes," Margaret said, "you will." She opened her laptop and projected a single PowerPoint slide. Patent analysis, 147 patents, 1995 to 2015. "I'm going to show you something," she said, "and when I'm done, you're going to realize this isn't about credit. It's about systematic intellectual property theft." For the next 6 hours, Margaret walked them through her evidence. She showed them design files with timestamps, her files dated months before the patent applications. She showed them emails where she'd explained specific technical solutions to problems, followed by patent applications using her exact language. She showed them video recordings of meetings where Richard had said, "Let me think about that," followed by him presenting her idea as his own the following week. She'd organized everything by patent number, cross-referenced with dates, highlighted patterns. The attorneys stopped taking notes and just stared. One of them finally spoke. "Ms. Chen, do you realize what you're alleging here?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I'm alleging that Richard Hartwell built his entire career on stolen work, and I can prove it." The investigation took 8 months. During that time, Richard Hartwell seemed completely unconcerned. Why would he worry? He was the CTO. He was untouchable. He had no idea that the company had quietly brought in forensic digital analysts, that they'd recovered deleted files from old servers, that they'd interviewed 17 former employees who'd left the company under mysterious circumstances. Every single one of them had stories about Richard. Every single one of them had been silenced with NDAs and severance packages. But NDAs don't apply when you're testifying in an internal investigation about potential fraud. The final report was 287 pages long. The conclusion was devastating. Based on the evidence provided, we find credible support for Ms. Chen's allegations that Richard Hartwell systematically misappropriated her technical contributions and claimed them as his own inventions. We identified 89 instances across 140 sedan patents where Ms. Chen's documented work predates patent applications by significant margins, with substantial similarity in technical approach and language. The company's board called an emergency meeting. They offered Richard 2 options: resign quietly with a settlement, or face a public lawsuit and federal investigation for intellectual property fraud. Richard chose to fight it. Biggest mistake of his life, because here's what he didn't understand. Margaret Chen hadn't spent 20 years building a case just to watch him walk away with a golden parachute. She wanted justice. The case went to arbitration first, required by her employment contract. Then, when Richard violated the arbitration agreement by leaking confidential information to the press, it went to civil court. Which brings us back to that courtroom, 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Margaret's attorney stood up and said, "Your Honour, we'd like to present Exhibit A through Exhibit DDD." That's right, Exhibit DDD, 30 separate file boxes of evidence. The judge looked stunned. Richard's attorney looked pale, and Margaret? Margaret just sat there, calm as glass, watching 20 years of meticulous documentation destroy the man who'd stolen her life's work. The trial lasted 3 weeks. By the end, Richard Hartwell had lost his job, his reputation, and his patents. The court ordered a full re-examination of every patent with his name on it. 89 patents were reassigned to Margaret Chen as the primary inventor. The financial settlement was substantial enough that Margaret retired immediately, but more importantly, the tech industry was watching. 6 months after the verdict, Margaret gave a keynote speech at the Grace Hopper Conference, the largest gathering of women in technology. 3,000 women in the audience. She stood at that podium and said, "People ask me if it was worth it. 20 years of my life documenting theft instead of just moving on. And here's my answer. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because every email I saved, every timestamp I recorded, every piece of evidence I preserved, that wasn't just about me. It was about the next woman who gets told her ideas aren't really hers. It was about creating a roadmap for how to fight back when the system protects the powerful instead of the truth." She paused, looking out at the audience. They'll tell you to let it go, to move on, to not make waves. But sometimes the waves are exactly what's needed. Sometimes the only way to change a broken system is to drown it in evidence so overwhelming that denial becomes impossible. The audience stood up. The applause lasted 4 minutes, and somewhere in a small apartment in San Jose, Richard Hartwell watched the live stream and realized revenge isn't a dish best served cold. It's a dish best served with 10,000 files of documentation, 287 pages of forensic analysis, and the patience to wait until your enemy has everything to lose. Margaret Chen had waited 20 years, and when her revenge finally hit, it was absolutely devastating. This story demonstrates how systematic documentation, patience, and strategic timing can overcome institutional power structures. While revenge may seem satisfying, Margaret's real victory was establishing precedent and creating accountability in an industry that had long protected bad actors. Her case led to policy changes at TechVision and influenced how tech companies handle intellectual property attribution, a legacy far more valuable than any personal vindication.